Vivica Pearl is many things. I'm sure we're all aware of this by now. A gorgeous, cruel, calculated, but undeniably genius detective. But above all, she is traumatized, even if that isn't made immediately transparent. But why is that? Where does she come from? Why is she so ruthless, and what exactly happened that made her the black-hearted, cold-blooded, callous lady she is? It's a famous question asked by just about everyone in Delphine City at one point or another, but requires a lot of backstory. So I'm gonna go through Viv's life, hit the highlights, explain why her PTSD has come back for a reunion tour, how that negatively affects her and who she's become, and why there is no hope for this exquisitely beautiful but terribly depressed woman. Vivica Ann Pearl, you see, is the only daughter of Delphine City's Elliot and Anastasia Pearl. Brought into the world on April 7th, sometime in the 1900s, don't even think about asking me for historical accuracy, the girl was fortunate enough to be born into extreme wealth, as her father was a famed detective and her mother a renowned seamstress and fashion designer. She is the epitome of a child born with a silver spoon in their mouth. She has all the privilege in the world. But despite the riches and luxury she was blessed with, she still faced hardships. As any socialite will tell you, life isn't always the safest when you are so well known. Naturally, being born into wealth will garner you some negative attention, but especially when you're a child of the law. Viv's father, Elliot Lee, was a detective, and he was one hell of a detective at that. Truly one of Delphine City's finest. Though admittedly, just because he kicked ass at his job does not mean his life expectancy didn't drop by, 20 years when he put on the badge. But Elliot was a darling despite that. He was a great dad, adored his daughter, and was the kind of parent to come home and immediately scoop Viv up in his arms and ask her all about her day, no matter the kind of one he had. His wife and daughter always came first. It was that same kindness he treated Viv and Anna with that earned him the respect he had from his colleagues. He was always peaceful and morally right when approaching his cases and saw the good in people, despite his experiences with the most awful, vile souls that his job required of him. Was that unheard of and looked upon as weak and kinda contradictory back then? Yes. Yes, it was. But Elliot was a progressive guy for the 1900s. Elliot was kind of like Olsen in that way. He saw the world for how it could be and how he wanted to make it. Keep that connection in mind, by the way. It's kind of a big reason behind Vivica's burning hatred of Olsen and co. But moving on. Regardless of how kind Elliot was, he still had his fair share of enemies, as most detectives do, due to their wealth and, of course, the danger that comes with having a well-known yet still antagonized law enforcement worker in the family. Anastasia grew paranoid, and especially wanted to protect Vivica. So, I don't know how else to word this, but Viv grew up pretty estranged. No, pretty isn't the right adjective here. Egregious, yeah, egregiously, unhealthily estranged, the way a child should never be estranged. That's more accurate. Anastasia, bless her soul, was concerned about the safety of her daughter. Completely understandable, I get it, Elliot was as well, anyone would be. But the way she handled it may not have been the best course of action, and that's the understatement of their century. See, Viv grew up very reserved as a result of her mother. She went to a private school, spent most of her time inside, and was really only allowed to play out. It sounds a lot sadder than it actually is, but she went to a private school, spent most of her time inside, and was really only allowed outside to play in the garden or with her only two friends, Dolian and Elias Monroe. Keep note of her friendship with Dolian, it'll come in handy later on. But moving on again. Like I said, while she was very reserved and basically living life Rapunzel style, she actually was very kind. Viv's biggest problem, at least in her youth, was how awkward she was, resulting in her not having very good communication skills or skills in interacting with others and reading social cues. But for the time, it's not the worst problems to have compared to PTSD. And then her world was shattered before her eyes. Because you are reminded that this is me, and I don't stop at just one childhood trauma, which is what God probably said when creating me too. Like I said, Elliot was a wonderful guy. Great father, great husband, great detective. A real swell fellow. But he had enemies, as all detectives do, and one in particular was really stirring up issues for him. That man was one Arthur Enger, an infamous criminal of Delphine that had targeted Elliot for reasons still unsolved. But whatever the reason, Elliot had finally narrowed things down to him, resulting in the famous Enger shootout. During that shootout, Elliot, in his infinite grace and kindness, desperately did try to coax Enger out. Despite the hell Enger had raised, he still believed he could be redeemed, same as how he treated every other criminal he worked with. But unfortunately, his kindness became his demise. A single bullet was fired, hitting Elliot directly in the chest. He was shot after Enger tried to appear as though he was considering Elliot's peace offer before assaulting him. He died almost immediately before the paramedics arrived. Rest easy, though, because Enger did not get away with it. As with most shootouts, police were on the scene to promptly arrest him. But despite the present police officers, Elliot didn't survive. He died around 3:07 a.m. The first to get the call, naturally, was his wife. Despite the fact it was the early a.m. of the morning, Viv was awakened to the sound of her mother sobbing on the floor of the living room. When she went downstairs to ask her mother what was the matter, she was met with the sight of her mother, grief-stricken, shaking and sobbing on the floor, clutching the phone in one hand, having a nervous breakdown. Viv still didn't know what was happening when the smell of smoke filled her house as she tried to shake her mother back to reality, repeatedly asking her to talk to her because she was scared. Slowly but surely, the smoke started to cloud the house, and Anastasia was only snapped out of her breakdown when she heard the crackling of fire directly above her. She scooped up Vivica in one arm, panic settling in, just as the debris began falling. And trust me when I say Anastasia ran out of that house. Just not fast enough. Unfortunately, the still trembling, newly traumatized Anastasia was not fast enough to dodge the certain piece of burning debris that hit her, resulting in her dropping Viv to the floor as she, too, hit the ground, screaming. She wasn't down for very long, but it was too long for Anna, who, despite the agony she was in, scooped up her daughter off the floor and ran outside, just in the nick of time for Viv to witness her house burning before her eyes. She didn't know it at the time, but the piece of debris that hit her mother had burned the right side of her face. When Viv turned around, she saw the red and blue lights of police cars. When she turned back, she saw her mother collapse to the floor, still holding her tightly, to the point it drew blood, and saw her mother trying to cover the burn scars across her face. Vivica was 7 years old at the time. Even later, when at the hospital, as her mom was being treated and she herself was being treated for light burns, bruises, and cuts, she came across the pictures of the crime scene where her father had died. Anticipating the shootout, Enger had instructed those that followed him to set fire to the Pearl Manor in an attempt to kill his child and wife. Basically, if the shootout happened, Enger would have killed Elliot, and if it didn't, he still would have had his wife and daughter killed. Yeah. Safe to say Viv was never really the same after that day. And because it's me, my characters can't have good things, and Anastasia was recovering from trauma and some burn wounds at that, she grew even more paranoid, terrified at even the idea of Viv going outside after the attack on their family and home. Now, let me preface this by saying Anastasia is a good mother. She loves Viv very dearly. Her daughter is everything to her. She quite literally refers to Vivica as my treasure because she is the most important thing in the world to her. But she did totally fuck everything up. Viv was taken out of private school, away from maybe the only select few kids in her life that she considered her friends, was placed in homeschooling, and the family had to move to a smaller, more guarded version of the Pearl Manor, seeing as the original had been burnt down. Even now, if you were to ask the kids Viv used to go to private school with, they would speak positively of her, because they met Vivica Pearl when she was young. They don't recognize her anymore. So by now, Viv had been successfully isolated from, well, everyone. She had to move, lost a parent, was taken away from her only group of friends, and even the friends she was still allowed around, like Dolian and Elias, just served as an incidental reminder that her father was dead, as Dolian and Elias were, Monroes, the kids that would next take over the detective agency her deceased dad used to work for. Trauma is great. Good stuff. Huge fan. But the biggest problem there was that Viv was isolated from everyone. The outside world barely caught glimpses of her after her 8th birthday. The poor girl grew up terrified of the outside world. And why shouldn't she? She didn't have enough experience outside to form her own opinion of the world at the time. The very few bits of it she did experience were traumatizing and burned into her memory for the worse. I'd stay inside all day too. But that's all the trauma stuff for now. Don't worry, it'll come back later. It's important to know that Viv actually wasn't cold at this time. Not at all, actually. She was a paranoid teenager, yes, maybe a little bit socially awkward and easily startled, like I mentioned prior, but she was still a kind person. She was scared, but maintained her politeness and was open to the idea that the people outside her house could be redeemed and could be empathetic. She took after her father in that way. Or, at least, she took after him for a time. The problem really began again when she started studying to be a detective. Viv kind of always knew she wanted to be a detective ever since she was little. That didn't change at all as she grew up. Her mother was very against it, but she agreed to it the more Viv showed her dedication to the job. And it's right about this time where Viv really entered her downward spiral. See, in all actuality, Viv was terrified. She wanted to be a detective, but she had not healed from her trauma as a child. She wasn't ready. Really, she should have waited and given herself the time she needed to recover before coming out for a job heavily connected to her deepest traumas and paranoia. But she didn't. She didn't wait, because the outside world was watching her. Or, at the very least, she felt as if the outside world was watching her. And she felt it the second she stepped out of her manor for the first time in, quite literally, years. She felt like all eyes were on her. All the news that came out was about her. Her and the fact that she was carrying on her father's legacy and was brave enough to go into detective work after what happened to her. Much like how animals try to never show any signs of weakness out of fear their perceived weaknesses will result in them being hunted, Viv didn't want to seem afraid. She was, but she didn't want to come off that way because she was terrified at the idea of becoming a detective and immediately seeming like prey for the dangerous people of her city. She didn't want to appear like this weak, traumatized woman that could be taken out with little to no effort. And it certainly didn't help that the most famous story about her, i.e. her immense trauma of losing her father and her home, is what defined her to the public. She was endlessly paranoid. She was always tense, but she didn't want to appear that way, so she acted like she wasn't. She kept her head high, never let her tics show, and went very public about the fact she was a detective. It was the best coping mechanism she could come up with at the time. She bought her old house, the one that had burned down, and had it rebuilt to live in as a message to the perceived villains around her that she was recovered from any of her prior childhood trauma. And yes, that was a lie, but it worked. But over time, the more she worked and the more gruesome cases she saw, her paranoia only became worse. And Viv knew that. The act could take care of the outside world, but not herself. She knew, even then, that she couldn't go on living like this. Working as a detective only made her life worse. Vivica was aware at the time that she was paranoid to all hell. She couldn't eat. She developed insomnia. She started inexplicably twitching in fear, in both silence and noise. She couldn't even walk into a slightly darkened room in her house without almost crying and freezing up in terror. But, see, the world didn't see that Vivica Pearl. They saw Detective Vivica Pearl. They saw her achievements. They saw the crown jewel of the detective agency. They saw a beautiful, smart, and sharp woman who even some of the most hardened criminals feared. And yeah, they were seeing a facade, but that facade was the only thing keeping her safe in her eyes, even if it wasn't helping her mental health. So she went on. Viv hates admitting weakness. It's one of the reasons she can't stand Harkin, who she sees as the most weak, pathetic person she's ever had the displeasure of knowing. She couldn't stand the idea of letting the outside world see the terror she truly lived in when she was alone. Viv also hates the idea of admitting her problems to herself, because if she did, she'd have to accept the fact that she's not ready to be a detective, and it's far too late for that. So, she didn't. She deluded herself. She tells herself that she's not working hard because she's paranoid, she's working hard for justice's sake. I'm just dedicated. I'm just a good employee. I just want to follow in my father's footsteps. I just want to make the world a better place. And over time, she actually began to believe that. And it's not like anyone was there to tell her otherwise. She didn't have any friends and barely any family left after all. She had pushed everyone out of her life by throwing herself into her work, the only thing she did have. The only thing that she had left. The only thing that could distract her from the memory that plays on repeat in her head. And slowly, in an attempt to keep herself safe and sharp and quick-witted in case of any perceived threats, she snapped. She made herself into the woman you know as Vivica Pearl, detective extraordinaire, who verbally and physically abuses her coworker, never admits exhaustion or burnout from an emotionally and physically demanding job, and who shoots an innocent police officer straight through the back for no other reason than being upset. Viv has a lot of problems. She isolates herself out of fear of being hurt by people, not to mention because she didn't interact with enough people in her youth to have good people skills. To prevent the possibility of being hurt, she overworks herself, hoping to keep herself sharp and prepared for any possible danger, passing it off to herself, and others, as being very dedicated and invested in keeping justice. She pushes the few people she had in her life away because she feels if she stops working to do anything else, her guard will drop, if only for a second, and she'll be shot through the chest like her father, or her house will be burned to the ground, or she'll die some other horrible, horrible way, like the victims and cases she's read about and dealt with. And she has nothing, really. No real relationships. She has nothing in her life to live for. The only thing that vaguely matters to her is her job. It's her crutch. It is the only thing she has, and even that makes her miserable. But I think Viv's biggest problem is how alone she is. She's terrible with social cues and can't hide her cruelty or irritability in conversation, like many people have learned to do. They don't want to ruin the mood of the interaction. And thus, she doesn't really have any friends. The closest she had to a friend was Dolian, who she loves, but who is very different from her. She appreciates him, and he is maybe the only person she shows physical affection to, but their relationship is built far more on the fact that they knew each other as kids rather than because they are actually friends in the current day. And, Dolian dies, which knocks what is based purely on history, her best friend, off her roster of relationships. And Viv couldn't even really make new friends, if we're being honest here. She gets overwhelmed and is on the brink of a panic attack every time a new person is vaguely in her vicinity. She is so scared of the unknown, of the potential danger that comes with it, that she runs from everyone. She runs from everyone she doesn't know. And it's not like Viv talks with her mother very regularly either, even though she does love her. She's just too consumed by her work to have a social life and therefore makes herself worse. And she can't snap herself out of this unhealthy cycle by herself. She needs someone to help her, because without intervention, she'll be miserable and terrified for the rest of her life. But Viv doesn't have anybody. She's all alone. And that is the tragedy of Vivica and Pearl.